All right, y'all, let's let this magic happen. Our first session is Parents, It's Not Your Fault. I would like to introduce parent, Ms. Resha Conroy. Ms. Resha brings almost 2 decades of experience in charter school administration and nonprofit management. She has an MPA in nonprofit administration from NYU, where she is now an MS candidate in speech language pathology. She is the mother of 2 children with learning differences, including a son with dyslexia. Her personal and professional experiences led her to found the Dyslexia Alliance for Black Children, which is a nonprofit committed to addressing the intersectionality of race and dyslexia for Black children. Ms. Resha, it is your turn to shine.
So good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you are. And thank you so much for the introduction. And thank you, Decoding Dyslexia Oregon, for hosting this very important event. So again, my name is Resha Conroy, and you've heard a brief overview of my background. But what brings me to this part of the day and to this workshop is my experience as a parent of a son with dyslexia. Now, you may be wondering, why are we starting the day with a session titled, Parents, It's Not Your Fault? Right? And that's a good question. It's a great question. There are 2 things that ring true for me about starting here. So the first is that when we blame parents, we're essentially removing responsibility from the school and from other decision makers to make real change and to address the root cause, which is that students need to be taught to read. And you'll hear more about how later in the day. The second reason is that when we blame parents and families, there's the potential to do negative, long-lasting damage to the family and to the child. Right? But when we think about it, it seems directly opposed to what we think of as the mission and purpose of a school. Right? Are our schools and our institutions really blaming families? Well, it was true for me. It's true for many of the families I speak with, and it's probably true for many of you. So what does this blame look like? You know, what happens when we're interacting with the schools that set the stage for this blame game? Because the blame is not always direct. And in the early stages, it can be hard to detect because it's pretty well coded. Well, for me, it began when I expressed concern that my son, who was in kindergarten at the time, was not being taught to read. Now, my son, he had a history of language delay, and he was having difficulties with oral language in the classroom, and he wasn't acquiring reading skills. Now, these are all red flags. So at my request, they did an evaluation, and they denied him services. And they gave me the wait to fail language. So I heard things like, well, he's really young, or give him more time. Right? Parents hear this all the time, but this only delays intervention. But the message that they're sending you is that your expectations that your child should be taught to read is unreasonable. And this sets the stage for the blame game. Right? But sometimes the blame game, it's more direct. It's still coded, but it's more direct. And it comes in the form of these loaded questions, which imply that you might have done something to cause the difficulties, right? So questions like, well, how many books do you have in the house? Or, oh, how often do you read to your child? And it's not that these things shouldn't happen, because these are good things to do, but acquiring reading is not innate. It's not a natural process that just happens through exposure. Most children need explicit, systematic instruction. But the intent of these questions is to make you think that you caused the issue, right? And if we're specifically talking about dyslexia, we know that it's neurological, so it's brain-based, and there's nothing that a parent does to cause this issue. And if we're talking about reading in general, we know that most children require structured literacy to be proficient readers. So when my child was denied services, I decided to get an independent evaluation because I didn't agree with the district. And when you start to advocate for your child and it seems like you're challenging the school system, well, the heat on the blame game gets turned up, and it goes from blame to battle mode. And that's what happened to me when I was advocating for my son. So in formal meetings, teachers would roll their eyes and they would nudge each other under the table as I was speaking. Just a lot of tactics and emails and language that was targeted at me to try and silence me, to villainize me, and to turn me into that parent, all because I expected that they would teach my son to read. Now, I was fortunate. I had one ally on the IEP team, and my son did get an IEP, which is the individualized education plan. But getting an IEP is not always enough, and it's often not the end of the story. So one of my final or my last straws was in my son's first grade year. And it was at the end of the year at his IEP meeting. So in New York State, there is a section on the IEP that's titled Parental Concerns, right? So this is the opportunity for a parent to express their concerns in their words. So during the meeting, I expressed my concerns about my son's reading, his oral language, and it's all related, and some social issues that he was having as a result of these things. But when I received the IEP, what they wrote was not what I said. It was carefully edited and revised. So I called the coordinator, and the coordinator was the special education teacher. So she had been working with my son on a daily basis. And I told her that, what you wrote is not what I said. And I reiterated my concerns. So she was very nice. She said, okay, I'll call you back. I'm going to speak to the IEP team. And she did. She called me back. She called me the next day. And she told me, I spoke with the IEP team, and we decided that what I wrote is what you said, and we're not going to change it. Right? What a way to silence a parent. But schools, they don't just blame parents. They also blame the child. And we hear things like, oh, they need to try harder. Or, well, if they paid attention, they would get it. Or they start to use the child's behavior as the cause or the reason for the difficulties with learning, when very often the behavior is a response to the learning difficulties that are unaddressed. And the behavior, it might look like the child is, I'll put this in quotes, acting out, or it can be inward, and it can look like anxiety, depression, or even school refusal. Now, in some children, and this is often in older children, schools may blame a child so much that a parent isn't even sure if it is the child. The parent might even start to believe the lie. And that fractures or may even break the child's relationship with the parent. It certainly damages the child's support system, and it damages the child's self-esteem. So I ultimately left my public school district, and I was fortunate to have a private school in the area for children with dyslexia and language-based learning differences. And it's a wonderful school, but it came at a cost, and it's not just financial. This is a cost that a lot of families pay. There was an incredible emotional cost as well, and there was a real upheaval of my family. So now you may hear all of this and still not be quite certain if this is really happening, right? Are schools really doing this? So I want to share the results with you from an article that I read recently, and it was in the Professional School Psychology Journal. And they asked 50 school psychologists to reflect on the cases that they had over the previous year. So there was a total of about 5,000 cases. And the survey was informal. It asked them to identify what they determined to be the cause of the child's learning difficulties. Now, they gave them 5 choices, and they could select more than one cause. So the 5 areas were, number 1 was curriculum. So we know this is important when we're talking about literacy. Number 2 was the teacher. Again, really important because a teacher has to be trained to deliver instruction. Number 3 was the principal/school administrator. So these are our decision makers. Number 4 was the parents/home environment. And number 5 was the child. Okay, so the results, right? Almost none of them identified curriculum as the cause. None of them identified the teacher as the cause. None of them identified the principal or school administrator as the cause. Now, this is where it gets interesting. And this is why we're starting the day here. 10 to 20% identify the parent or home environment as the cause. And 100% identify the child as the cause. Right? This was painfully alarming to me when I read it. And it's our families and it's our children who are feeling the pain. Now, our conversation today is about literacy, but it's not just about literacy. It's a summit on Black literacy. So before I go, we need to peel this back one more layer. And I'm going to pose the question. It's a question I wish I didn't have to pose, but this is where we are. What happens when the child is Black? Now, I know from my days in education reform and from personal experience, but if you Google teacher expectations in Black children, you're going to find numerous studies and articles that provide evidence of systemic racial bias in teachers' expectations. So basically, lower expectations for Black children. You're going to find even more articles about this plague of deficit thinking when schools interact with Black communities, with Black families, and with Black children. For my son, and at the time we were in a high-performing public school district where the expectations were generally high, but they weren't high for my Black son. I heard things like, well, it's okay that his reading skills are on the low end of average. And the school psychologist said to me after my son performed well on a non-reading test, wow, are you surprised he's so smart? Right? Low expectations. So when we add race, the blame game is even deeper and it's even more damaging. It's historical. Our history with Black literacy goes back to systemic barriers purposely constructed to keep Black Americans from learning to read and carefully crafting this fallacy of deficit thinking. Are parents to blame for that? So what can we do? You'll get a lot of answers here today, or the beginning of solutions. And you'll see that there are no quick and easy answers to this. But I'm speaking to you as a parent. So as a parent, if you're wondering, well, what can I do next? I'll tell you what I did and what I'm still doing, because I'm still very much in this. I have a 3rd grader and I have a 5th grader. So find support. Look for your local organizations or your state organizations. It might be a Decoding Dyslexia, or it might be another advocacy group, and connect with parents who have that shared experience. And you want to find organizations that understand that equity has to be part of any literacy movement. What happened for me when I connected is that I learned a lot from other parents and from advocates, and I had access to support. More importantly, my experiences were validated, and I understood that the feeling I had that this was urgent was true. I'm also going to invite you to join the Dyslexia Alliance for Black Children, and the website is our name, dyslexiaallianceforblackchildren.org. And you can be part of our growing network of support and empowerment for Black families. So sign up there and we'll keep you updated as we roll out our programs and resources. So thank you, and I'm going to pass the baton to Sherry Lucas Hall.
Thank you so much, Ms. Resha. That was some powerful information. Thank you for sharing your story today and lending your voice.